So I'm really happy now to welcome our next speaker, Tom Webb. Tom, you're going to present your research and tell us a bit more about how you got involved into cryosphere research. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. So my talk today is about changing community, a cryosphere perspective. And what I mean by that is when I was thinking about what I wanted to present at COP, I thought, what a great opportunity to say for how I got into climate science and also how I found this community and then how I could then influence other communities around the globe. And so explain a bit about my research in the coastal cryosphere. So this is where I started my working life. This is Canary Wharf in London. It's the home to big business in the UK. And I was working there in international business. And I would still be working there today if it wasn't for a very important event that happened about 12 years ago. This was the global financial crisis, the meltdown. And I remember when I was working there, I was working in a really tall building in a skyscraper. And I would look out of my window in the winter and there'd be snow on the ground. And it was just as all the big banks had collapsed. And I would see people leaving the tube station and going into their buildings and collecting their belongings and putting them in boxes and coming out and going back on the tube with them. And it was a really hard place to work, especially at that time. And I remember looking down on them from my vantage point because they looked like ants making trails through the snow. And it was just it's just a very bleak environment. And so, but it was an opportunity for me. And it was an opportunity for me because I was, for the first time ever, I wasn't studying for a qualification and I wasn't trying to get to the next stage in my job. And I could really think about the world around me and what made it special. And so as business wound down for me, I was able to go out and I was able to go to public lecture events and talk to academics and find out more about the world around me. And that's what led me to the Royal Society. This is one of the most inspiring talks I went to. It was on the UK Climate Projections 2009. And for me, it was an opportunity to talk to researchers, academics who were professionals. Some of them were professors, and I could talk to them one-on-one as if I had something to offer to the conversation. And the UKCP itself was a document that made some important projections for the future in the UK in terms of rainfall and temperature, and also it included area-specific information on how different areas of the UK should proceed due to climate change. But I was able through this to find a community which I felt I could really connect with and I could make a big difference to. And that's why I chose rather boldly to take my life savings and spend them on my education. And just 7 short years later, I held a PhD in meteorology and climate, which I thought was really important because it was a chance for me to change my career and gain a community through which I can make a true impact to the world. And this community is represented all around us. It's vast and it spans lots of different researchers all over the world, some of whom are also in other pavilions at COP right now. And here I've included just 3 photos that illustrate projects that I've worked on where I've been able to make an impact to communities. So on the left-hand side, there's a photo of Norwegian fields, and this is something I'm going to come on and talk about later. Then in the middle, there's Piton de la Fournaise, which is on Réunion Island, and this is a project I worked on with the French government to mitigate volcanic risk for that island. And then on the right-hand side, if you can see this, these are boats, these are fishing boats off the coast of Ghana. And this references a project that I worked on with African climate researchers in order to enable them to advise Western weather centers, because even though the science exists for researchers from remote communities to better the world, often the pathways for them to get their research out there don't. So that's what that was about. And now I'm going to come on to the subject of my research, which, when it changes, is on the coastal cryosphere. And this this is something I want to talk about from a community perspective. So thinking about impacts of the coastal cryosphere on communities, and ideally how we should be looking towards the future. So here I have 3 images of the coastal cryosphere. And one thing, when we think about the cryosphere, especially the coast, I find that when I talk to people, they have a vision in their head about what the cryosphere is. And here I've got some images to hopefully try and break down that vision and just explain what it means to me. Because the coastal area of the cryosphere is not just about the sea ice or the transition from the land to the ocean. It's also about cities. So there are 4 million people that live on the coast in the cryosphere region. In cities like, on the right is Murmansk in the north of Russia. And when I'm thinking about the cryosphere, I'm thinking of another coastal community, just one that's a bit cold. So from that point of view, there are communities all over the world that are affected directly and indirectly by the coastal cryosphere. So there are 680 million people living in low-lying places around the world. And if you think about it, just because the cryosphere is in certain regions of the world, if you're living on the coast in other regions, you will still be affected by events happening there. Nothing changes because you're moving from the cryosphere to other areas of the planet. And so changes, for example, sea level rise, ocean acidification. So when I'm thinking about ocean acidification, I'm thinking more about how, if animals are in an area of high acidification around the cryosphere, how their food webs are disintegrating because the underlying chains of the food webs are not able to support themselves. And so as we build up towards bigger and bigger animals, for example, polar bears, if we're seeing, say, the polar bears dying, it doesn't mean it's just confined to the polar bears. It's their whole food web that's being destroyed. And I believe that's a fairly important point to make. So what I'm trying to say is that all coastlines are affected by the cryosphere, no matter how far away they are. In terms of fish, for example, they might be pushed out of warmer waters because of global warming, and they might move north. But if they're then moving into more acidic waters, then that's going to destroy their ecosystem. They won't be able to survive there anyway. So really, when I think of the cryosphere, I think of a global problem. And also I wanted to touch on some of the indirect effects. Now, these are things that I'm not sure everyone is aware of, really. So these are things that affect us right here in Europe, and also in other areas of the world, because just because something is thousands of miles away does not mean it doesn't affect you. So one good example of this is Antarctic ice melt, and how there's a disproportionate sea level rise in the northern hemisphere due to Antarctic ice melt. So if you had, say, a 1 foot rise in sea level due to Antarctic ice melt in the Southern Ocean, you may expect a 1.3 foot rise in Europe. Then there's also the ice-free Arctic. So it's currently predicted that we will have an ice-free Arctic in the summer months in 2035. 2030. So when we first started talking about the climate and the risks to the climate, we were talking about things that we thought would happen to our children or maybe even their children. This is a risk that will affect us, people in this room. So it's just in 15 years' time, if we're lucky. And so one point about this from a meteorological perspective is that if we have an ice-free Arctic, there's recent research that leads us to believe that this will reduce the strength of westerly winds over Europe, and this will have a two-pronged effect. So firstly, you have these drought conditions that are, say, over the south of Europe, and you have these westerly winds that are barreling into them to push these drought conditions to move them on. And if they're not strong enough, that just won't happen. And so you'll have these extended droughts. And then the other point there is that if the westerly winds aren't strong enough in the winter, you then might have more extreme winters as the winds push in from the east, from Russia. So the other point here that I wanted to make is the subject of my own research. So this concerns the Paris Climate Agreement, and this is a point for policymakers predominantly. So the Paris Climate Agreement was an agreement to hold emissions so that we would have a maximum of between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade global temperature rise based on a 1850 to 1900 baseline. And that was true because that was what they agreed to, because that is the legal definition of pre-industrial. But the climate doesn't care what the legal definition of pre-industrial is. And so my research concerns trying to find out what happened, what the global temperature rise has been since the pre-industrial era. Because it could be the case that, and it looks like it might well be the case, that if we, say, have meet emissions targets and we manage to secure a 1.5 degree temperature rise, that actually we will see the effects of a 1.7 degree temperature rise. And that you might think that's a very small amount, but in terms of the cryosphere, when we're thinking about tipping points at 1.6 degrees for Arctic sea ice, that's actually a huge difference. And so it's something that policy makers should be aware of. So with that in mind, this is really my final slide. I call it the big picture. And I hope I've demonstrated today that all communities everywhere are dependent on the coastal cryosphere. It's not just something that affects a very small part of the world, and it's something that affects highly populous areas in Europe, in North America. And yes, so once the cryosphere changes, it cannot change back. The process is irreversible. So a good example of this would be, say, if an ice sheet was to collapse, you cannot restore that ice sheet. And unfortunately, due to the way we're heading at the moment, we're on course to close to a 2.7 degree rise in global temperatures. Because of that, some of these changes are going to be unavoidable. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can ask them now. You can also email me. I've included my email and Twitter on the slide. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? So the question is, what is my goal for the COP? Do I have anything specific in mind. I really want to. So I personally really want to network with lots of different communities. I want to get people engaged and thinking about the cryosphere and thinking about what it means to them. And I mean, ideally, I would like to see some real progress towards meeting that 1.5 degree goal that was agreed in Paris. Rather than countries, say, aiming for the upper end of that, aiming for 2 degrees, I'd really like to see them aim for 1.5 degrees. I mean, ideally less, but I just I don't think that's going to happen. No more questions?
Great. Thank you very, very much, Tom, for this great presentation. And I'm